Hey everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful of David video. This video is going to be a little bit different than usual, as you can probably guess given the circumstances of everything that we're in. Real quick update, our newest episode for Mouthful of History is out. We talk about Dunkirk. If you want a break from just all the, chaos that's going on right now, check that out. But, otherwise, onto the video itself. I am releasing it a little bit earlier than usual because I will be going to a Black Lives Matter protest in a couple hours. So that's why I'm not, releasing this in the evening like I usually do. But anyways, with that being said, what I wanted to do was put together a video about Black history and specifically suggested figures to look into, resources to look at, books to read by mostly Black historians. We really want to make sure that we're centering Black voices as much as possible. I'm not Black, of course, so I want to do what I can to kind of, boost Black scholars and activists and stuff on here. So with that being said, also just a reminder before going in that for, everything that I recommend, you don't have to take a class about stuff or read entire books or anything like that if that's not something you're into. You can always look at stuff like speeches, interviews, articles, even YouTube videos if you can trace the creator to a credible source. So history is for everyone, and if you don't want to read an entire book or something, that's totally cool. Just look in however you would like to. So with all that being said, before I get into talking about a couple different eras and figures and groups from those eras, just some Black historians to recommend right off the bat. My personal favorite is Manning Marable. He's really incredible. I'll talk about him a little bit more during the segment about the civil rights movement, just because he has my favorite book out about the civil rights. But Manning Marable, incredible, my favorite. Also John Hope Franklin, Benjamin Arthur Quarles, Carter G. Woodson, and the man himself, W.E.B. Du Bois, who I'll talk about not just as a historian, but also as a historical figure in a bit. So those are some people to check out as historians. There's also a website called blackpast.com, and that website is a really accessible website for articles and speeches and some of the other stuff that I was talking about that aren't entire books. That's a really good website to check out, and most of the historians there are Black historians. Anyways, with that being said, what I'll do now is just kind of go over a couple historical eras and just mention a couple figures, a couple orgs, and just anything else that I think is noteworthy to kind of look into. So starting off, I'll talk just really briefly about abolitionism, some famous abolitionists to look into. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, whose names you probably know, but they're two figures where you have a general sense of them, but when you kind of, study them again, beyond what you've kind of remembered in the classroom, you really are reminded how incredible they are. And also, extra details about their lives that we don't always talk about in classrooms or in other places where they're brought up. Harriet Tubman, in addition to, playing such an important role in the Underground Railroad, she was also very active in the women's suffrage movement. So she was, doing what she could to try to get women to vote. Frederick Douglass, he was involved in the early stages of Black labor movements. And so, there are extra dimensions to them beyond what we usually talk about. A couple other folks to look into: Sarah Parker Remond and Sojourner Truth. Really important, incredible Black women who worked as abolitionists during, that era. A book that's super accessible is The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass by the man himself. And it's really powerful. It's really, really short and really easy to read. Frederick Douglass taught himself to write, and he was amazing with both the spoken and written word. And so this is just kind of a quick book that pretty much anyone can honestly pick up and finish in a day or two. So moving from there to Reconstruction. Reconstruction, if you don't remember what that is, basically after the Civil War, there were questions about how the South would look, and so Reconstruction was the attempt right after the Civil War to try to rebuild the South along more kind of egalitarian, equal lines, and especially for newly freed Black folks, right? And so some really interesting figures to look at during that time. Hiram Revels was the first black U.S. senator. Joseph Rainey was the first black member of the House. Robert Elliott, very interesting. He was also involved in politics as a representative, but he was both darker skinned and more radical than most of the other Reconstruction era black politicians and activists of his day. And so he has a really interesting and I think important story. And I put a couple people here that come just after Reconstruction because, they're also very important and interesting, and I think they help kind of bridge the gap between Reconstruction and the era of like the Great Depression and the New Deal. So one is Ida B. Wells. She was a little bit after Reconstruction, and so she was a journalist and an activist who basically was trying to fight for civil rights in the very bleak era after Reconstruction was ended, when white supremacist violence was widespread against black folks, especially in the South. There's also Lucy Parsons, who was a radical labor activist and who kind of, helped bridge that gap between labor and the experience of black Americans. And so Lucy Parsons was just an incredible figure in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So definitely look into them. Books about the era of Reconstruction itself. I would highly recommend Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, who I mentioned a second ago. He's a really interesting guy because he was born in 1868 and he lived until 1963. So he was born right after the end of slavery and lived until the Civil Rights Movement. So he kind of tried everything as a civil rights figure and just saw so many eras and had such an interesting, great, in my opinion, perspective that you should, read whatever you can by him, basically. Another book that I'd recommend that is not written by a black author, so just to kind of note that, but, does its best to center black folks, is A Short History of Reconstruction by Eric Foner. He actually draws a lot from Du Bois, but Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction, I don't remember exactly when, but I want to say in like maybe the 40s, and then Foner wrote it later. So it's kind of like a shorter, more updated version of a lot of what, Du Bois is saying, but from Eric Foner. And again, it's short, so it's really easy and accessible to read. Another resource that's really good is the Zinn Ed Project. They have an entire section about abolitionists, and I believe one about Reconstruction too. So if you just go to zinnedproject.org/material/abolitionists, then there's good stuff about the abolition movement, and then there's also a Reconstruction one as well. Going to the Great Depression/New Deal era, which I think is sometimes not quite talked about enough. There's a lot of great stuff there. A really important figure, probably like the main figure I would kind of point to during this era, is A. Philip Randolph. He founded the Union, which was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters during the 30s. And so he was big about, organized labor for black folks and trying to, bridge that gap between the labor movement and civil rights, or black rights, because civil rights wasn't the most prominent term at the time in the 30s. But really incredible figure, incredible labor organizer, and later on, of course, an advocate for civil rights. This is also an era where W.E.B. Du Bois is very active, so just, repeating his name. There was also the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was a multiracial union in the South, but predominantly white and black, and, about relatively similar numbers in membership. And they were a farmers union that was multiracial in the South, which was kind of, intense during that time, an intense thing to be. And a black organizer who became vice president of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which is STFU for short, was E.B. McKinney. And so he is another fascinating figure that is very worth looking into. Also, there was a labor organization called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a kind of umbrella labor group. And they were rivals with the AFL, which was another umbrella labor organization group. And so the CIO was more inclusive than the AFL. And that was true just in general because the AFL kind of liked craft unions and stuff. But The CIO was more about just kind of like any kind of union could join. And they were also like explicitly pro civil rights, pro integration, which again, during the 30s, not super, super popular, right? But they did an impressive amount. Another person to look into is Mary McLeod Bethune. She found a variety of Black women's advocacy groups, including during the Great Depression, the National Council of Negro Women. So, there's a lot of great history during this time, and history that we would in the modern day call intersectional. The intersection between Black history and labor, the intersection of race and gender for Black women. A good book is Southern Labor and Black Civil Rights by Michael Honey, another non-Black historian, just to throw that out there. And, he kind of traces the link between the labor movement in the South, which wasn't very strong but did exist, and how a lot of that would lead to the Black Civil Rights movement later, including with figures that were active in both the labor movement and the civil rights movement. There's also a few books about A. Philip Randolph, and you kind of can't go wrong with any of them. Another good resource, just kind of while we're talking about labor too, is there's an article by Teen Vogue called Black Women in the Labor Movement that is very, very worth your time. Finally, civil rights. I mean, what more can you say, right? I want to talk about certain figures that aren't always talked about, but first, real quick, MLK, Malcolm X. A quick note about them is that they're not as like flat and one-dimensional as they're sometimes portrayed, right? Like, MLK wanted integration, and he was, all about nonviolent protest, and then Malcolm X was more militant, and he wanted, Black separatism and liberation. But for both of them, like, things kind of wrinkle in different ways, and also they went through different stages, right? So like MLK during the like early and mid 60s, he kind of is just that like nonviolent pro-integration activist, but as we get later into the 60s, he talks more about the evils of poverty and militarism and connects them to racism. And sometimes we forget, when he was assassinated in 1968, he was speaking to Black sanitation workers as part of the Poor People's Campaign that he was trying to get going. And so, there was a lot more to him than just being the cuddly pro-integration teddy bear, right? Malcolm X, at first he's part of the Nation of Islam. He's all about Black separatism and liberation. And he always is about Black liberation, but, he goes on his pilgrimage to Mecca, and his perspective becomes more... some people say that he became more moderate. I don't think that's the right way to phrase it. I think a better word would be more internationalist. He saw Black liberation after his pilgrimage to Mecca as part of a greater global movement of oppressed people. And so it wasn't that his views softened so much as his scope was widened, basically. But anyways, with that said, some other people that are worth checking out. Robert Williams is a really interesting figure because he kind of danced along that border of being, peaceful civil rights and militant Black power, sort of like the border between those things. Robert Williams was just kind of there, and he actually did get kind of pushed out of the limelight of the civil rights movement because he was willing to arm and protect himself. And he's just a really interesting figure that's, again, very worth your time. Stokely Carmichael kind of has a similar story, but whereas Robert Williams was, I believe, a World War II veteran, Stokely Carmichael was, someone who went from a young pro-integration idealist to more of a, militant self-defense sort of standing. Of course, there's the Black Panther Party. They are just this incredible group that is all about Black empowerment, but also solidarity with, all oppressed people around the world. They did everything from, armed self-defense patrols to healthcare clinics, free meals for school children, just incredible group. The main person that everyone thinks about, of course, is Huey P. Newton, who's very much worth looking into. There's also Fred Hampton, who was, gunned down when he was very young, horrifically by law enforcement. There's also Elaine Brown, who was the first female chair of the Black Panther Party. I had the pleasure of meeting her when I was an undergrad at UCI, And so, looking into her is, checking out her story and everything is very powerful. And, it goes back to what we would call intersectionality, right? There is also Addie Wyatt, who was a leader of labor and active in the civil rights movement. And so she's, another example of different struggles coming together. Angela Davis, one of the most radical but, powerful figures in the civil rights movement. Bayard Rustin, who was a civil rights organizer, a labor leader, and was gay himself, and so was into, advocating for LGBTQ rights. So he is like the ultimate portrait of intersectionality, basically. And then, of course, you have Marsha Johnson, who was a black trans woman who stood up at the riots in Stonewall, or Uprising, really. Some books that I'd recommend. To me, the best book ever written about the civil rights movement is Race, Reform, and Rebellion by Manning Marable. Really incredible. I've mentioned it before, I think once or twice. And what's really great about it is it talks about different segments of the black community and different approaches that were taken by different communities in the civil rights movement. And so, Marable makes the distinction between like poor working class and middle class black folks, or, those involved in the church versus those in labor versus those who were like small business owners versus those who were like intellectuals. It's just a very great history that is, not super long, is very readable, and does a good job, again, of looking at different groups and how they kind of came together during the civil rights movement, which I have a copy right here. It is very good. Of course, the autobiography of Malcolm X. I mean, how could I not, right? How could I not talk about that? James Baldwin has two books that he wrote, two nonfiction books during this time that are kind of, I guess you could call like social criticism of the era, or social commentary of the era. One, The Fire Next Time, the beginning letter to his nephew is just incredible. I didn't like the second section as much. I personally prefer actually No Name of the Street, but honestly, you can't really go wrong with either. And if you're into fiction, read his novels. They're incredible. He's my favorite writer of all time. And I don't have it with me, but Revolutionary Suicide by Huey Newton, that's basically his autobiography. Also, just anything by Angela Davis is always worth checking out. So, I hope this video was helpful, everyone. Again, history is for everyone, and I mean that both in the sense that you don't have to look into super academic sources to become more historically informed, and then also, history is for everyone, including, black folks and other marginalized people, and just when you're looking into stuff, look at as many sources as possible, but also make a point to make sure that you're looking at black scholars, black creators, and stuff like that when you're looking into this. So thanks for listening, everyone. Stay safe out there. Good luck. And I'll see you next week.